Thanks everybody for everybody's flexibility. A lot of last minute moving pieces.
Okay, we just went live.
Afternoon.
Hi,
Hello, Mark.
Hey,
Mark, I am still having trouble logging in, so I'll call you later.
okay.
We're all going to figure this out by the time December 22nd hits. Then we'll be like, I'm an expert.
I think I'll figure it out on January 15th.
Oh, there you go. I feel like I'm always calling Mark.
Not a problem.
We're going to have such accumulated redistricting knowledge and then nothing to do with it for 10 years. Hello, Senator Rios. Welcome. We're waiting. We have not yet started. We're waiting for one more commissioner, our Vice Chair Watchman, and then we will start our public meeting as soon as everything is convened.
Great, thank you.
Okay, I see Vice Chair Watchman has joined. Are we, I know that we have both Senator Rios and Representative Bolding speaking. Are both of you, Senator, going to speak together at the same time, or are you joining first and he will join shortly after you?
I will begin the comments and then he'll do the second half of comments.
Okay. Okay, I think we may be ready. If I could just get a sign from our staff. I see Representative Bolding has joined as well. If I could just get a thumbs up from staff that we have all of our key staff members and council in place.
I believe we do.
Okay.
Except for, yes, thank you.
Okay, excellent. Welcome, everybody. We'll dive right into our agenda. Agenda item 1, call to order and roll call. 1A, call for quorum. It is 12 noon, Thursday, December 2nd, 2021. I call this meeting of the Independent Redistricting Commission to order. For the record, the Executive Assistant, Valerie Newman, will be taking roll. When your name is called, please indicate you are present. If you're unable to respond verbally, we ask that you please type your name. Val.
Thank you, Madam Chair. Vice Chair Watchman.
Present.
Commissioner Lerner.
Present.
Commissioner Meal.
Present.
Commissioner York.
Present.
Chairperson Newberg.
Present.
And for the record, also in attendance today, we have Senate Minority Leader Rebecca Rios, House Minority Leader Reginald Bolding, House Majority Speaker Russell Bowers will be joining us in a bit. We have the General Counsel for the House of Representatives, Andrew Pappas. Not sure if he's on the call. Executive Director Brian Schmidt. Is he here? Yes, there he is. Deputy Director Lori Van Haren. Community Outreach Coordinator Marie Chappell. And from our legal team, we have Ryan Regula from Snell and Wilmer, along with Brett Johnson and Eric Spencer. Roy Herrera and Daniel Ariano from Ballard Spar. And our mapping consultants, we've got Mark Blahan from Timmins and Ivy Beller-Sikansky from NDC Research, and our transcriptionist, Angela Miller. That's everyone.
Okay, thank you, Val. Please note for the minutes that a quorum is present. Agenda item 1B, call for notice. Val, was the notice and agenda for the commission meeting properly posted 48 hours in advance of today's meeting?
Yes, it was, Madam Chair.
Thank you, as always. Agenda item 2, approval of minutes from November 30th, 2021. We have 2A, the general session. We also have 2B, the executive session, in which we did a district level analysis of VRA compliance and a review of constitutional criteria. I will open it up to my colleagues if there is any comment or discussion on either the general session or executive session minutes. If there are no comments, I will open it up to a motion to approve 2A and B, the general session and executive session minutes from November 30th of earlier this week.
We'll move. This is Commissioner Lerner. I move to accept the minutes.
And Commissioner Meal seconds.
If no further discussion, Vice Chair Watchman,
Aye.
Commissioner Meal,
Aye.
Commissioner Lerner,
Aye.
Commissioner York,
Aye.
Commissioner Newberg is an aye, and with that, the minutes from November 30th are approved. Thank you, Val. Agenda item 3, opportunity for public comments. We will now open public comment for a minimum of 30 minutes and remain open until the adjournment of the meeting. Comments will only be accepted electronically in writing on the link provided in the notice and agenda for this public meeting and would be limited to 3,000 characters. Please note, members of the commission may not discuss items that are not specifically identified on the agenda. Therefore, pursuant to ARS 38-431.01H, action taken as a result of public comment will be limited to directing staff to study the matter, responding to any criticism, or scheduling the matter for further consideration and decision at a later date. With that, we will move to agenda item number 4, Arizona State Legislature leaders' reports or memorial submissions related to draft maps pursuant to Article 4, Part 2, Section 1, Paragraph 16 of the Arizona Constitution, with potential discussion and deliberation concerning such submissions. As we mentioned earlier, we have Senator Rios, Representative Bolding, who will give us remarks. We welcome whatever you would like to share. We have until 1 o'clock with you. We absolutely welcome the opportunity to do some Q&A. I know I have a few questions if the time allows, but the floor is yours till 1. If we finish before then, we'll take a brief recess and we will welcome Speaker Bowers at 1 o'clock. So with that, please, Senator Rios.
Thank you, Chairwoman Newberg. Thank you to the members of the Independent Redistricting Commission and to the members of the public watching this critically important process. I'm Senate Minority Leader Rebecca Rios, and I am joined by House Minority Leader Reginald Bolding. We're honored to be here at your invitation in our official capacity as leaders of our respective Democratic caucuses. We have submitted a formal letter to the commission, and we will be reading it into the record for the benefit of those folks who don't have access to it. Dear commissioners, 20 years ago, Arizona voters established the Independent Redistricting Commission to provide a fair, equitable, and transparent process for drawing legislative and congressional maps. The voters clearly and unequivocally expressed their intention that self-interested politicians be removed from this task and instead put the awesome power of redistricting into the hands of average everyday Arizonans. As leaders of the Democratic caucuses in the Arizona legislature, we respect the decision of the voters and value the independence of the redistricting process. Simply put, it is better for our democracy when the voters choose their elected officials and not the other way around. Arizona has led the nation as a role model for independent redistricting, and we are proud of that legacy. We do, however, have some concerns that the actions of this commission may call into question its independence and may cause Arizonans to have doubts about the integrity of the process and the fairness of the resulting maps. There have been a series of split votes among the commissioners on a range of important decisions, from hiring employees and consultants to crucial decisions on the draft map. For example, on a 3-2 vote with the chairwoman siding with the Republican commissioners, the commission voted to hire an executive director who had previously worked for a Phoenix City Council member and former Republican congressional candidate. The newly hired executive director had previously worked for Martha McSally's Republican Senate race and received significant payments from the Republican National Committee. Following that decision, the chairwoman again voted with the Republican commissioners to hire Timmons National Demographic Corporation as its mapping firm, despite knowing their concerning history of ignoring input from communities of color, misrepresenting the Voting Rights Act, and using incomplete redistricting data. As further evidence of their partisan tilt, those same mapping experts were recently nominated in Virginia as special masters for the Republican Party in that state's redistricting process. As the commission began the critical work of deliberating on the draft maps, we saw further partisan influence undermining the independence of the commission. The commission considered a map out of hundreds submitted by the public that was created by the second vice chair of the Pima County Republican Party, for which support was orchestrated by a sitting Republican senator from Pinal County, Vince Leach. But Senator Leach was not open and transparent about his role in crafting the Southern Arizona Republican District. He hid behind a well-respected organization, and it was only through the intrepid work of local journalists that his role was finally revealed. And despite his deception, or perhaps because of it, those legislative configurations in Southern Arizona have remained in the draft map, despite not conforming to several constitutional criteria. To date, this is the only public mapping submission that has been considered without incorporating significant adjustments. And again, the vote to adopt this partisan map, which was labeled 9.2, was 3-2 with the chairman voting with the Republican commissioners. The proposed map that was supported by the Democratic commissioners, labeled 9.0, was rejected on a vote of 2-3 with the chairwoman siding with the Republican commissioners again. Throughout the mapping process, the chairwoman has repeatedly sided with Republican commissioners as maps were discussed. In 5 of 6 split votes during the October drafting process, the chairwoman voted with Republican commissioners. These actions of the commission and the resulting draft map suggest a politically imbalanced commission that is not seeking to represent all voices in Arizona, but is instead prioritizing the wishes of one political party. In addition to the concerns we have regarding the commissioners' pattern of voting, we also want to bring to your attention some concerns we have with the draft maps themselves. The commission has created a draft legislative map that fails to uphold the spirit of our independent commission, positioning Arizona to lose the legacy of fair and balanced maps. Below, we examine several examples where we believe the commission is not complying with all of the constitutional criteria and responsibilities of redistricting. And we will cite the criteria and then provide our example. Criteria A, districts shall comply with the United States Constitution and the United States Voting Rights Act. The adopted draft legislative map creates few districts in which Latinos could elect a legislator of their choosing. Though the Latino Coalition demonstrated that additional districts could be drawn to further achieve representation without compromising the other constitutional criteria, the commission instead chose to include fewer Latino majority districts, thereby undermining the voices of this growing community. The adopted draft map only creates 7 Latino ability to elect districts. Proportional representation for Latinos would result in as many as 9 districts to reflect the population of Latinos in the state overall, and the Latino Coalition demonstrated a moderate proposal of 8 Latino majority districts. For context, The 2011 approved legislative map created 7 Latino ability to elect districts. Since the time those maps were adopted, each district has grown significantly in Latino voting strength because of the increase in Latino voting age residents. The packing and cracking of Latino voters in the adopted draft map raises significant concerns under the Voting Rights Act. Specifically, draft District 24 appears to be packed to dilute overall Latino electoral strength. Draft Districts 22 and 23 also include highly racially polarized voting areas that dilute the performance of Latino voting strength. Additionally, we believe the Commission has not given due consideration to the submission of tribal communities, failing to draft even one map that considered the requests of the Navajo Nation. Under the adopted draft map, District 6 would limit the ability to elect a Native American candidate in the primary election due to historically low turnout among Native American voters. The district performs in general elections, but it can potentially limit Native Americans' opportunity to elect 2 Native American state House members and a state senator. Criteria 2. Congressional districts shall have equal population to the extent practicable, and state legislative districts shall have equal population to the extent practicable. Our concern. The population deviation in the legislative districts appears to largely favor Republican interests. Population deviations were not utilized to uphold Voting Rights Act criteria as requested by the Navajo Nation, but instead the greatest deviations are in districts where Democrats are packed, like Districts 11 and 21, or in districts that are underpopulated to favor Republicans, like District 28. Population deviation should not be used to favor partisan outcomes in legislative districts, particularly at the expense of other mapping criteria. And Representative Bolding.
Thank you, Leader Rios, and thank you to the members of the Independent Redistricting Commission and the members of the public who are watching this incredibly important process as well. I'm House Democratic Leader Reginald Bolding from the current Legislative District 27 in Phoenix. As Leader Rios stated, we are here at your invitation in our official capacity as leaders to discuss some of the specific issues with draft maps that we sincerely hope you will take into consideration before making any final determinations. And I want to continue with some detailed additional analysis and observations, again, measured against the plain language of voter-approved independent redistricting law. Point C, districts shall be geographically compact and contiguous to the extent practical. And D, district boundaries shall respect committees and communities of interest to the extent practical. This commission has been applying the definition of community of interest so broadly that there seems to be no boundaries as to what a community of interest truly is. District 17 has separated a number of communities from their neighbors, thereby undermining fair representation for these communities at the legislature. In the November 5th commission meeting, the commission's own mapper described evaluating compactedness as asking, quote, "Are we bypassing people to get to another group of people?" Unquote. And District 17 is certainly a district that bypasses geographically close communities in order to connect fair suburbs from partisan goals. Furthermore, when citing her support for this District 17 configuration, the chairwoman said, "The right of center voters deserved an ability to elect someone to represent them," suggesting that a partisan district would be the only way to accomplish fair representation. Gerrymandering a Republican district for partisan outcomes is simply not necessary. Members of our Democratic caucus have served along Republican members for a number of years, specifically in Tucson, like Ethan Orr, and currently enacted District 9, and Todd Klopfelter, currently enacted District 10, over the last decade. Providing that Tucsonans want to be represented by a Republican, they effectively secured such a change at the ballot box, ignoring the will of voters and drawing a partisan district instead of a competitive one disregards history, takes power away from voters, and ignores the constitutional obligation to create competitive maps when there is no significant determinant to the other constitutional goals. Competitive districts has not caused significant detriment to voters of either major party in Tucson. Point E, to the extent practical, district lines shall use visible geographic features, cities, towns, and county boundaries, and undivided census tracts. The commission has been, at best, inconsistent, and at worst, directly partisan in applying visible geographic features. South Mountain in Maricopa County, for example, has been a clear geographic boundary for legislative districts. However, the Catalina Mountains in Tucson have been ignored and skirted for the drawn. Public testimony identified Mingus Mountain, Yavapai County, as a
Who's ever on the cell phone with the last two digits of 33, please mute yourself. Thank you.
Thank you, Chairwoman. Public testimony identified in Mingus Mountain in Yavapai County as a clear geographic boundary for communities of both sides, yet the commission has ignored such vocal testimony. Lastly, point F, to the extent practical, competitive districts should be favored where to do so would create no significant detriment to the other goals. Competitive districts are, in many communities, the way to allow diverse yet connected communities and political interests a chance to be heard. Competitive districts are those where a candidate from either party could reasonably win a seat, and as a result, where candidates and elected officials must compete for the right to represent a community. The commission adopted several measures of competitiveness, but even by its own analysis of the districts, only 2 legislative districts in the adopted draft map would truly see a competitive race over the next decade. For far too many, districts still remain safe for either party, failing to deliver voters a competitive race. In the past, our Democratic caucus has provided specific input and mapping advice to the commission because we believe that the voters in Arizona have spoken clearly that they do not want to see politicians constructing the districts and choosing their voters. Today, we still believe that an independent commission can create a fair and balanced map that reflects the state of Arizona and its residents properly, ensuring good representation for the next decade. However, this can only be accomplished when the 5 commissioners are committed to applying the provisions of the Arizona Constitution in an honest, independent, and impartial fashion and to upholding public confidence in the integrity of the redistricting process. We raise the concerns above and call on the commission to renew its commitment to a balanced and fair map that will represent Arizonans fairly throughout the state. Thank you, and with that, we'll be happy to stand for any questions.
Thank you both. We're deeply appreciative for this opportunity to have feedback and to have dialogue. We will now open it up to questions. I'm gonna actually take the prerogative to ask the first one. And I also just want to say we have some time now, but if there's additional discussion, I am available and would very much welcome an ongoing conversation. So whatever, conversations we're having that still remain to have things to be talked about, I would like to continue the conversation. My first question has to do with competitiveness. And I want to be honest, I'm a little confused and I'm really struggling with how to navigate this constitutional criteria. So the very first constitutional criteria of honoring the Constitution and the VRA, after we accomplish that, depending on whether we have 8 or 9 majority minority districts, there's a mathematical reality that when you account for those 8 or 9 districts, they're overwhelmingly Democratic. It just happens to be that those communities of interest generally align with that party. So when you're looking at the other 2/3 of the state, it's no longer a random sample of population. It's actually a highly biased population in terms of partisan leanings. So when you ask for competitiveness, I see 3 different ways of going about it. I see, do we take the whole rest of the state? And are you asking for competitiveness to be a prime constitutional criteria where we seek to make all of the rest of those districts as competitive as possible? Which has some challenges because they'd all be biased on one side in terms of political leanings. Are we talking about creating as many tight competitive districts within just a few percentage points, which maybe we can do, a few, at which point, if we focus on that, it tends to leave the other communities of interest kind of in a random splatter all over the state. Then we have what I think all commissions are kind of struggling with. How do we merge both those tasks? And I'm wondering if you have feedback to us about your preferences with how we define competitiveness. Is it shrinking the differences with as many districts as possible? Is it creating truly, the most competitive districts that we could, and then trying to somehow figure out the rest of the population? Help us understand what you're asking for.
So I'll go ahead and jump in. And clearly, I'm not here today professing to be the expert on this. That is, in fact, you and the tough job that you all have. What I will say is what I have heard from different groups and constituents is that folks want the ability to actually have a district in which someone of either party has a real opportunity and chance to be elected. And so to the extent that the commission is able to minimize the number of districts that are heavily slanted, either Republican or Democrat, I think that's what the average Arizonan is looking for. I think competitiveness is a high priority for many of the folks that I've spoken to. And again, how that exactly is determined, again, the devil is in the details. And it is, I recognize a science that you all are struggling with, but where we have identified districts in which there is packing or underpopulation, I think those are the areas you can start with to begin to work on competitiveness and perhaps not packing so many in District 11, which is my district, but using those additional folks to maybe have more competitiveness in other areas that surround it. That would be my response.
And thank you, Chairwoman, Commissioners, for that question. I mean, the reality is I don't believe that demographics clearly should be used as just on a partisan basis. And I take from the question that demographics equals one party or the other. The idea regarding competitiveness is important. And if you have districts that are significantly slanted Republican or Democrat, it does not provide a choice for those members in the community. In fact, we should be thinking about how do we make sure that the partisan split is in a place where it may have single digits. I mean, if you have an opportunity for a district that is a +25 district or a +15 district, R or D, it's not competitive either way. The reality is people need to have a choice. If we want to create a state where voters truly feel like they can have their voices heard, competitiveness has to be a priority with communities of interest. I don't think it's a either or, it's a both and I think that the commissioners have the ability to do that with, and should have the ability to do that because we know that it's something that's possible.
Thank you very much. I'll turn it over to my colleagues. I just want to share when you say it's not an either or, just from a mathematical perspective, sometimes it actually is an either or. So that's why I'm seeking your feedback, because it's really complicated, you know, and we want to make as many competitive districts as possible. So with that, I open it up to my colleagues.
This is Commissioner Mule with a question. And again, I thank you both for being with us. We really appreciate your time and the importance of this process. You've both been elected in districts that were formed in 2011 by the second commission. And you're obviously then familiar with the districts as they sit today. The 2011 commission was very overt in saying that competitiveness was actually a really critical component of how they looked at creating maps. Do you view the 2011 commission maps as being positive examples of achieving competitiveness, or would you be critical of those?
Again, I'll go ahead and start. You know, without where I will speak from is my perspective of having served in the legislature for the majority of the past 10 years. And where we're at today, we are finally at a point where there's only a 1 vote margin between Dems and Republicans in both the House and the Senate. So I guess long-term, it could be argued that some of those districts have eventually become competitive to the point where we almost have parity in the legislature. But to make a blanket statement in terms of, do I believe those are the maps that we should hold up as the model as they were created in 2011? I don't have, I think, the expertise or the knowledge to answer that, other than to say that I think it is important to note where we are now as the eventual result of those maps, and the fact that we are closer in parity, the parties, than we have been since the 1960s.
I mean, and I would, so thank you for the question, Commissioner. When you take a step back and you look at Arizona, it's a lot more purple than it is red or blue. That's the reality. I think the 2011 maps had, they were created, and I think that as you look at the current legislature today, it shows that we're a lot more purple than we are red or blue. You know, the reality is, when you look at our state legislature, when you look at our state offices, there is a mixture of Republicans who are serving statewide. There's a mixture of Democrats who are also serving statewide. Additionally, as Senator Rios mentioned, both the House and the Senate is divided by 1 vote. So I think that in any map that's created, it should absolutely not only think about the current context of where we're at today, but the current context of where we're at in the future. And I don't think the future has us more partisan either way. And I think that is going to be extremely important. You know, in 2010, when you looked at the state and you looked at statewide offices, it's a totally different picture than when you look at 2020 and the statewide offices. And we could literally go office by office at a statewide perspective and see how that has changed. And that is extremely important, that we are not pulling in one direction. And my hope is that as commissioners, you take that into context because it is extremely important.
Thank you. I want to just point something out before, I open it up to other questions. In terms of competitiveness, just for the public to be aware, I think we're conflating two definitions of competitiveness. There's the competitiveness within each district where either candidate could win. I think I'm hearing a little bit from our minority leaders maybe alluding to competitiveness as it relates to the number of Republican versus Democratic elected leaders. That's a different definition and something that this commission is not responsible for. That is not part of our constitutional duty. So let's just be careful with what's competitive within a district versus competitive within parties.
To that point, Madam Chairman, I view the competitiveness, I was speaking to competitiveness within the districts, and that because that now exists, we are within one vote margins, one party to the other.
Okay.
This is Commissioner Lerner. I have a question. You've got rural and urban areas, and one thing we have been, and you allude to some of that in, with the Native American question that you have, comments that you have, but I guess I'm curious because in the party, right, in each party you have rural and urban, and you have to balance those out. We have been talking a lot about that as well, on how do we balance the needs of each constituency. Do you have any thoughts on that? Because, if you go to the rural areas, they don't want to be with the urban areas, and the urban areas don't want to be with the rural areas, but for population balancing purposes, we find that we struggle with that. So I'm curious about your insight of that in terms of how that affects your ability to serve your constituents when you actually have both in your district, and also any thoughts that you might have in general on that balancing.
I'll go ahead and start. I think that and this is an assumption that I'm making, both having served a rural district for a number of years and now serving an urban district. But when I served the rural districts, I think what I'm seeing now, and some of the comments I've heard with regard to one of the districts that was drawn, and I apologize because I have not studied the district numbers at length, but it incorporates a very rural area of Pinal County, Mammoth, Salmonwell, Dudleyville area, and takes them way far north with communities that they literally have nothing in common with. And so even though they may both be rural areas, that cannot be the only distinguishing factor. I think it's very important to also have communities that have similar interest, geographic, boundaries. I guess I'm not really explaining myself well. I have represented districts that have both rural and urban in them at the same time. And while it is challenging, and the example perhaps I'll give is when I represented Pinal County, you have very rural areas that are, the Gila River Indian Reservation, Coolidge, and Florence. But then you also have some areas that consider themselves more urban that were in the district, like Maricopa. But yet they were all within Pinal County and had a number of, I think, factors that they identified as at least being from the same community. So it is possible. I think importantly, though, the commission needs to ensure that in an effort just to put perhaps rural areas together, that you're not stretching from one county to another, because when you talk to the people within those communities, they express frustration that they've got nothing in common, nor do they know anybody from that side of, that county. So, again, I don't, I understand this is a very complex issue. But again, my comments on that, Representative Bolding.
Yeah, no, thank you for that. I mean, the reality is, in order to create, districts that simply are just all rural or all urban, we understand the complexity that that may have, right? I mean, the reality is Arizona. What makes Arizona so beautiful is that we have both urban and rural parts that and folks who live in these communities that can bring their voices, and have legislators that can bring their voices to the process. I think the important aspect is looking at communities of interest, also looking at making sure that you're looking at competitiveness as well, and geographical lines. Those things matter, and if there's a way in order to meet all of those criteria, I think that's what we look to do. The reality is whoever as a legislator, if you're serving in a rural or urban community, you want to make sure that everyone has their voices heard, and it's hard to speculate, how a legislator would act if they had a community that was both urban and rural. But one would hope that they're serving their constituents equally. One would believe that if there was either rural or urban, they may bring a different skill set and a different voice to the legislature. But I think that the criteria are important, and that's extremely something that needs to be taken into account.
Thank you. Madam Chair, this is Vice Chair Watchman, and thank you, Senator and Representative. I don't have a question, but more of a comment. We're following a process, and I appreciate, what you're suggesting. In the last few weeks, we've been receiving comments, great comments, from the community, which I think enables, at least for me, how to better look at the districts. And I know we've talked about as a commission with the 6 constitutional requirements, we would, try to give equal weight to all of it. And that might not be the case. But as we move into final deliberation, at least for me, it was great to hear your comments. It was great to hear comments from the community. We basically canvassed the whole state. And so I think for me and my purpose, I'm better equipped to look at the final districts and have input, to address, the 6 constitutional requirements. And so I hear what you're saying, and I grew up in Indian country, and so I'm very happy to be on the commission to speak on behalf of the tribes in the state. And so, but thank you. The last 3 weeks has been really enlightening for me in what our Arizona citizens have been saying. So I just want to make that comment. It's a process, and I'm looking forward to the next 3 weeks of really, working with my colleagues to incorporate what we heard. So, but thank you for your time this morning. I really appreciate it.
Thank you.
Thank you. And I just want to lift up, our tribal nations' voices are extremely important, and Arizona is uniquely situated, to have a large tribal voice, and I think that your presence on the commission means a lot, and I think it's extremely important. So thank you.
Thank you.
I have a follow-up question on that, but I first want to defer to Commissioner York, who has not yet had an opportunity to ask a question, if he would like to.
Commissioner Newberg, I'm fine. I'm listening. That's good.
Okay. I have a follow-up question that perfectly fits with this line of conversation about the Native American community. You mentioned in your letter some frustration that we, didn't further embrace the submitted map from Navajo Nation. If I remember correctly, during the deliberation process, that initial reaction had to do with population deviance. Population deviance is a precious commodity. The 14th Amendment, one person, one vote, equal population, that's really the essence of ensuring the equality of the power of our vote. And we know that there is some legal room to relax those rules in order to accommodate injustices, and honor our responsibility for the VRA and our minority communities. I'm curious, as you're keeping your eyes on our entire population, what population deviance are you comfortable with? And which regions and which communities of interest do you feel are most entitled to those? That's a confusing, difficult decision for us because, again, it gets at that very basic level. Like you said, packing, cracking, one person, one vote. So where are the boundaries with what you feel constitutionally are safe for our state? And who do you feel deserves that the most?
Thank you for the question, Chairwoman. I mean, I would pose the question to the commissioners, right, who have to make that decision, right? I mean, the reality is if we're running a robust process and we're listening to communities of interest, if we're giving people access and opportunity to share their concerns and share what would make the most sense for them to who they would love to have an opportunity to represent them. I think that's important with regards to a specific number or a specific group. Again, like you've had an opportunity to listen to our communities. You've had an opportunity to look at maps, and that question is posed to you all as that's your duty to do.
Anything to add, Senator Rios?
No, just that I think, again, I understand that, that it is a science and this is a difficult process for you all, but I think what we wanted to also bring to light is those districts in which, there were tremendous deviations and, again, like District 11 or District 21, where it appears as though there are a large number of Democrats being packed in those areas. And just to draw attention to that, that at the end of the day, again, District 11 is my district, but I am not looking for a packed district. I really hope this commission can land on as many competitive districts as possible, because at the end of the day, I believe that is what the voters intended with the IRC, and that is why we have chosen to bring some of these issues to the forefront.
I have one request, and then I'll turn it over to my colleagues again. I'm deeply appreciative that you're deferring to the commission and saying it's our judgment. But when we use our judgment and then you come back and criticize us or attack us that it's not meeting criteria, as we're going along, we're deeply interested in your live feedback. So let's create a system. We're going to have open public comments throughout the entire process. If you do have specific opinions on some of these detailed issues that we're talking about, please feel free to weigh in. Because again, you're recognizing that we have a lot of deference and it's our discretion. It's not always clear cut, and there's a lot of very difficult compromises that need to be made. So.
And thank you, Madam Chairman. I understand and I understand that. And I think from my perspective, I believe the Democratic caucuses have been very careful in terms of telling our members not to be testifying in front of the commission, not to be providing specific opinions, because again, we are of the mindset that this is an independent redistricting commission. You have a job to do. However, where we have identified what we believe are glaring concerns, it's incumbent upon us to raise those issues. Again, in terms of us identifying every specific issue and issuing our opinions, I personally don't believe that is what the voters intended. They don't want us micromanaging this. But again, to the extent where we do believe there are glaring concerns, that is what we wanted to provide to the commission.
I mean, and thank you again, Chairwoman. We deeply respect the independence of the commission and also the will of the voters. I think that's extremely important. And you talked, about compromise, and I think that's important. And I think that as we think about, maps, as we think about, votes, I think that we consider that as well, because I think that is important. I think our communities and the voters of Arizona will be looking at that.
Chairwoman, if I could have one more. First of all, I do want to say thank you very much for you taking the time to meet with us and for actually your letter and comments that are identifying concerns. I appreciate the fact that you took the time to kind of think through what we're doing and give us some things to think about as we move forward. So thank you for that. I do have one last question about the packing question. When we look at things that are part of, for example, the Latino Coalition proposals, very often, pretty much as a result of the demographics, it ends up that they're very highly packed with one party versus another. And it is a struggle to try to both meet the needs for the population and avoid the packing that happens for those particular districts. Other districts completely understand. I would love to see them balanced more. But do you have any thoughts on that, on how we could manage that better, where we're still providing the Latinos the opportunity to elect who they would like to, their preference, but avoid packing? Because I think we've all been trying to figure that balance out in some way. So again, thank you for any feedback and comments that you have.
Thank you, Commissioner, Madam Chairwoman. I guess I would point back to the Latino Coalition that in fact did submit 8 majority-minority districts. And if they were able to construct those, I guess the question then becomes, why would the commission remain at a stagnant 7 that were created in 2011? So again, perhaps the answer lies with maps that have already been submitted by that coalition that do manage to create 8 minority-majority districts.
Yeah, and I would echo similar comments, absolutely.
Any other thoughts, questions, comments? I find this incredibly helpful, very constructive. And I want to reiterate that the conversations can continue, of course, with deference and respect for open meeting laws. This is a unique situation in which the commissioners come together in the public eye. But we remain open to feedback. And I also want to commit, and I feel confident in this, that the 5 commissioners are deeply committed to a process of transparency, with integrity and ethics. And we will consider all appropriate arguments, and we will do what's right for the state. So I encourage all constituent groups to continue to weigh in on the merit of the arguments. And please stay in touch.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Okay, is there anything else from my colleagues? All right, if
No.
not, we are going to have a very brief recess. We have Speaker Bowers joining us at 1. And so maybe we can all dial in a couple minutes early and be ready for our next speaker. And with that, Senator Rios, Representative Bolding, thank you so much for joining us.
Thank you.
And
Madam Chair, I think Speaker Bowers is here. I
Yes,
think Speaker Bowers is
Speaker
here.
Bowers is online. Here he is.
Okay. Well, do we want to break or do we want to move right in?
Fine with me.
Okay, if everybody's good with diving right in, I will turn it over to Speaker Bowers. Speaker Bowers, just to give you an orientation, you have, the floor. We have up to an hour. We'd love to hear whatever remarks you'd like to share. The commissioners may have some questions and we can entertain some dialogue. But without further ado, I turn it over to you, Speaker Bowers.
Well, thank you very much. I want to make sure, is the volume or anything, whenever I get around a microphone, things go bad.
It sounds wonderful.
So please let me start by thanking you all and for being flexible to accommodate my crazy schedule. I am truly grateful for the hard work over many months that you have been involved in. And I cannot understate the historic nature of what you're doing. It will reverberate not only for the next 10 years, but for decades. And that is a truth. I'm therefore grateful for the seriousness and professionalism and thoroughness with which you've approached this assignment. I overheard questions and answers, and the depth of your questions and the probing nature is, I think, helps this entire enterprise. The Senate President and I are submitting comments to you, written comments. I want to today, if I could, focus on two particular concerns during the time that we have together. First, some favor a 15-15 partisan split among the legislative districts. And even the Commission's draft map, the 10.0 map, creates an even split according to the Commission's own metric. As the President and I detail in our written comments, such an even split would violate our state constitution. It would prioritize competitiveness over all the other criteria, which is exactly the opposite of what the Constitution commands. And an even split would prioritize competitiveness not in individual districts only, but across the Arizona map as a whole, which the Constitution neither contemplates nor accommodates. What I want to focus on, however, in this time, is on the practical consequences of prioritizing competitiveness. What really happens? Because they are counterintuitive. For good or ill, I have been involved in and around the legislature at the end of this session for now 30 years. I've served in chambers with both wide margins and narrow margins. I've served in a 15-15 split Senate. And for 3 sessions now, I have been Speaker of the House of Representatives that is split 31-29. The conventional view is that close margins by some means produce more moderate resolution to legislative questions. But from my long experience, I have the exact opposite point of view. In fact, the narrow majorities that I have seen, like the one I serve in today, actually empowers the extremes of political rhetoric and action. And it makes governance very difficult, not impossible, but at times so. Bipartisan coalitions can't form because the partisan stakes are so high with so little margin. Every member's vote is decisive, and defectors get what we would say flamed, unquote, threatened, intimidated, so that every member's range of legislative motion is compressed. The same is true when I served in the Senate when it was 15-15. The resulting gridlock magnified personal ambition in the Senate. And it in turn fostered more tactical and intense partisanship across them all in the House. Wider margins, in contrast, relieve that pressure, lower the stakes, and thus make cross-partisan maneuverability, depending on issues, of course, but allow that to be more possible and more productive. More compromising is available without being so intimidated. The same is true, I would proffer, for individual districts. An excessively competitive district with the narrowest possible margins will be a very unhappy district with very unhappy lawmakers. And why is that? Because there's no room for error. The range of motion, again, is severely restricted when there is no room to make a mistake. Legislators who are constantly looking over their shoulders trip more often. Legislators who must constantly walk a tightrope cannot focus on representing the broad constituencies of a district, and nor can they do so effectively. And in practice, hyper-competitive districts can be contrived only, hyper-competitive districts can be contrived only when disparate communities of interests are forced together in unhappy marriages. I would therefore urge that we adopt a final legislative map that is as sensitive as possible to these realities, but also reflects the political facts of our state. Numbers are numbers. Rural Arizona should stay rural. Tribal Arizona should stay tribal. And district lines should use city, town, county boundaries, and other geographic features wherever practicable, as the Constitution requires. Critically, the legislative maps should also be of equal population. This is my second point. Equal population, as our Constitution also requires. The legislative map that the IRC produced 10 years ago failed to do this and achieve this goal. Systematically overpopulating Republican majority districts and underpopulating Democratic majority districts. This commission should avoid making the same mistake and instead focus on producing a map that would fairly represent the population of our state. It is a truth about small things that small things many times have the largest consequences. People looking back at this new, relatively new construct of the Independent Redistricting Commission will take decisions on what you do. And it will affect, as we said, with significant repercussion, Arizonans for decades to come. So I wish you more than good luck. I wish you more than good luck. If Providence has any interest in the affairs of men, then it must be in their details. And surely this effort would merit that interest. And therefore, I wish you Godspeed. And I thank you again for your diligence and the work and balancing and evaluating all that's brought to you and to the service of our state. I wish you Godspeed. Thank you. I'd stand for any questions.
Thank you so much, Speaker Bowers, for joining us. I'm sure we have a bunch of questions. If my colleagues will allow, I'll start off with a question. You spoke about competitiveness as something that we need to be a little cautious about and focusing on communities of interest. As you look at our draft maps, do you feel that we have caused significant detriment to any communities of interest in order to pursue competitiveness in these maps?
Well, in the East Valley, the the nature of the communities across the state, where they grew, how they developed, the order of their development. Some are very new. They have new infrastructure, new cultural mores and thoughts and dynamics. And I think the districts in the east side of town have been, there's some communities there where we would propose and think that a tighter boundary configuration around existing community boundaries might be in order for your review. I would say that competitiveness is it's a conditional kind of a subsidiary criterion. It's not the guiding criterion. And it cannot harm, it cannot do detriment to any of the other criterion. And I would especially say to these communities of interest. And at times they may be difficult to define, but there are shared common characteristics and goals and history and values and even public virtues of education and emphasis on different types of application of education. And I'm sure, I can't imagine the thousands of people that have stood before you on your tours to try to describe what they feel is important, but I don't know of any instance where they have been so significantly diminished that it becomes, I don't want to use the word farcical, but damaging. But I would always start on the other end of the scale. I wouldn't start on the competitive scale. I would start on the community scale and then look to equalize the numbers by population. That would, I'm just talking, kind of thinking. And I don't even know if that was an answer.
No, thank you. No, it's a dialogue and it's an exchange of ideas and information. So with that, colleagues, questions?
Well, I'll start out with pretty much a similar question that I had with our Democratic colleagues, just on a rural-urban split, on your thoughts on how can we best achieve that, knowing that populations in the rural areas, you mentioned population deviations
Yes.
from last time, and we know that in our rural areas, it's very difficult very often because the population isn't there, and yet they don't want to be with urban areas. We don't want to be with, urban areas don't want to be with rural areas. It's like, both sides, we hear that. And we've been hearing that as we've been doing our public touring, a lot of concerns from people in both areas, urban and rural. So we are trying to figure that out. Population deviation might be one way to achieve that, but you were mentioning, your comment about population deviation would suggest we don't move in that direction. And I'm not saying what direction, because we don't know, but I'm just curious about your thoughts about how do we best achieve meeting the needs of the population and communities of interest in both rural and urban areas.
I'm grateful for the question. And it is rather a conundrum because fewer people live in a lot of communities around in rural Arizona. And I, raised in rural Arizona, up till recently, had some useful possessions in rural Arizona before the barbecue, and have a long history of relatives and friends who live mostly in eastern areas of the state. And I must echo what I'm understanding you heard from so many people, that they don't want to have the spoke and the hub system where they have to spoke into a heavily populated urban area in order to get sufficient numbers to have some population equality. That's the nut, isn't it? And so I would just say, as little a deviation as possible. Err on smallness on the population deviation and on the largeness of getting rural Arizona, keeping it rural in its representation. There is a different ethic in rural Arizona. And when they complain about, the state of Maricopa or the state of Pima County or whatever it is, it's real to them. And so I would just err on smaller is better. On all there's a lot of other questions that you have great counsel that can help you. But I wouldn't compromise the other criteria on the altar of competitiveness. There's going to be plenty of competition. People are going to be going at it. This is going to bring a lot of people's interest up in our system. So.
Thank you. And again, thank you for being here. I really appreciate your time.
Oh, you're the ones who put out the work. The workhorses are on that side of the screen. I'm just a show horse right now.
I have another question, but I'm going to turn it over to my colleagues first out of fairness.
This is Commissioner Meal, Speaker Bowers. I welcome you being here. Thank you for your incredible service to the state. And my question may be a hard one to answer, but as you look at the maps, I know that none of the 5 commissioners are happy with the draft maps, in case anyone is wondering. And we all know we have quite a bit of work that we'll be doing very quickly starting next Monday. Is there any district or area of the state that you think we've particularly missed on, or any particular place you'd want to point that you would hope to see a change?
I would be I would like to talk about one particular population that it's probably come up 100 times if you came anywhere near a retirement center, retirement area, and that is age. And there are areas of where elderly people feel that their particular needs, and now that I've stepped over from fall into winter of my life, early winter, that I would, Dave, as you, with your expertise and all the expertise of the membership, I would use that a little bit. That might be a population to focus on it, at least. There are many needs that go well beyond the individual members living in a community: hospitalization, access to health care. But we did make specific written comments that would probably be more, you could refer to them easier, Mr. Meal, specifically on districts 9 and 10 and on districts 2 and 4. There would be areas where I would just ask you if you might just give a little focus to.
Thank you.
Thank you, sir.
Chair Newberg, I have another question, if that's okay.
Please.
Speaker Bowers.
Yes, ma'am.
I appreciate your long history because that can actually provide some perspective. I'm very interested in your whole comments about competitiveness. We hear a lot about competitiveness, different perspectives that exist very often, probably because of depending on the party as part of it. When Proposition 106 was created at the time, and actually it was endorsed and proposed in 2000, and Republicans at that time, many Republicans did actually support this and help write the proposition, and it did list competitiveness right in the statement. So that's why I'm particularly drawn with your comments about that. Part of why my understanding was, in doing my homework as becoming part of the commission, that it was something that was important, is because there were so few candidates that were running for office. It was because the districts were so far apart within districts, and that's all we're focused on, is within districts, as our chair has noted, that we're not looking outside of that. But that there were actually, in 1998, there was a record low number of candidates because the districts were so skewed. So there was less choice actually for voters, which is part of why the proposition then was passed. So I'm particularly interested in, when you talk about competitiveness, as actually and having within the Senate or within the House, having more of an even split or 1 or 2 vote split between that makes it more difficult to actually legislate, and also why having districts within districts, why those competitiveness would harm the people in those districts. I'm not sure if I'm being clear on my question, but I'm intrigued by the fact that you feel that when you have good competition, that actually will harm folks within their districts more and harm the legislative process more, versus bring compromise when you have people who have to actually sit down and talk to one another because it is an even split, versus something where we say we don't actually have to try for their votes. We know we have the votes already. So if you could clarify or give some examples of how that worked, because I do remember when the legislature has been close, it seems like more compromise does occur, because you may not be able to get every vote in your own party, so you have to reach across the aisle, which is really what Arizonans want. We want to have balance in our perspectives, and really most Arizonans agree on most things when you look at studies that have been shown on what the direction of our state should be. So you mentioned how competitiveness harms the process, and yet when I look historically, I don't see that. So I would be curious if you could give some examples of your perspective. That would help me understand it a little better.
Well, I will try to do that, and thank you. One thing I will call it a little prelude to your question. When you talked about when this all began, I was there and was approached, and people told me why they needed to do it. And one of the reasons, frankly, from my Democratic friends, was they said, we're going to look for every way we can to try to get a little better shot at elections. We want to increase our capacity, and so we think this is one way to do it. But I would have to say that the intent of the voter is not what I vote on. I have to look at what the wording is in what was voted on by the voter. The rhetoric of campaigns is so often reduced to 3 words on a sign. It's for the children. Save our schools. Not about the details. And it's those details that I think are most illuminative of what this construct and what your task presents you. And it very clearly says that competitiveness within districts is the last criterion. I shouldn't have said it that way. That competitiveness is the last criterion. And I think that applies within districts as well as the numbers statewide. That we are looking at more the numerical equality of districts and their cohesive values that hold them together. What makes them a community of interest whose representatives should represent those values, concepts, cultural values, etc. And again, I may be, sometimes the more I talk, I think, no, please translate what I just said. We are let me speak then specifically. It is my experience, especially in very tight numbers in the House and the Senate now, that one person is the king. And I get to meet that king often, or the queen in the case of a couple of bills that came through. And that they insisted that while we had worked, there are many Democrats, and we don't have any. That's kind of a funny thing that we focus on Republicans and Democrats, yet 1/3 of our population is neither, or the voting population. But many of my Democratic friends would come to me and say, and they do, especially now, we want to work together. And I say, I'm for it. I want to. We have water issues. We've got border issues. We've got educational issues, healthcare issues. Surely there's things that we can work on in here. But when it comes through the process and it gets on the board, if one particular group, party, has said, we're taking a position on this bill, no one bucks that, no one wants to cross that line. And that's where I say the legislative maneuverability. I can give a little on this point, but please consider this point. Is there a give and take? That maneuverability is restricted because if you're not I won't use names because it's highly polarized right now, but if you're not with us, you're against us. And we will do a listing of all the poor votes you did and then show your poor votes compared to so-and-so's poor votes in order to flame you and primary you and beat you up. And I'll grant you, I don't know of many of my colleagues who don't have some ambition to be elected and that they want to represent their district, but not all districts have the same community of interest. And so their thinking is diverted away from their personal constituencies towards a partisan value. And with the difficulties of what we face and some very large challenges coming at us, I'm more sensitive maybe to this right now. I think of a very good friend of mine that I gave away turkeys with, somebody else's turkeys. I got to be there and hand them to people as they came by. But I served with him early on, my first years. And he has become very, very disconnected, disappointed, disjointed. He wasn't of my party, but he just says it's so highly polarized that one person with maybe a more conservatively radical or liberal radical, depending on what flip of the coin moniker we want to hang on somebody. But if the vote depends on that person, then we will not get the broad-based coalition that we had. We can't get there. And so it's kind of along those lines that my frustration and focus has developed on. Was that of any help?
Well, I guess I'm still not understanding, and that may be just me. So I don't want to belabor the point, but it might be I don't understand how we're certainly watching this in Congress, right? We have the one vote. And my thought is my question was kind of some examples, perhaps, because I guess I'm not grasping how if you have to reach across the aisle, that's to get the votes that you need, that's a problem. I don't understand why, if you have somebody in your own party who says no, unless I get this, but you know that all you need is one or two from the other party because you're close in votes, why that's a problem. Or in the same way that if I'm in a district and I know I have to serve all independents, Republicans, and Democrats within that district because it was a close vote and we share, that I can't just focus on one or the other. That's where I'm struggling to understand that perspective. But again, it might be my struggle, but if I'm serving within a district and I know the only way I get elected to that district is if I listen to all the voices, not just one party, that's where I look at competitiveness within a district, that I can only be elected if I hear from my Republican, my Democrat, and my independents. I can't be elected if I just listen to the Democrats or the Republicans. And I guess that was kind of my question to you on that. And I don't want to belabor this because others have questions, but that's where my question was coming from, was trying to understand why that's a problem versus saying, I will now listen to everybody that's in my district. So
That's,
I apologize, Speaker, for belaboring this point.
no, I think what you have presented is an intellectual view from the outside looking at how it should happen. And I think it's absolutely supportable and but the reality does not match the proposition. The reality is that if I have to reach across the aisle, then the person I go to is immediately identified. And that the intense pressure brought by the narrow margins of a district is felt on individual members not to defect. I believe you mentioned that we usually agree. And if you looked at all the bills that go on the board, most of them pass by larger margins than our partisan differences. But on the bills of real, on the big stuff, if I have to go across the aisle, it usually means it's going to fail. Because the price for someone coming to help us is really great. There have been exceptions. A couple of times that's worked. But I remember back, we had what was called the Sioux Nation. And there was several legislators named Sioux. And this, I can't remember who sang that song, you know, A Boy Named Sue. But there were several named legislators, and we could kind of say, all right, this block, and it was like 5, 6. We knew that they were a very maneuverable block. And so we didn't get into the tight stuff. We were already working to get a larger net of compromise on an issue because we knew we had to go there. And then it was easier to go across the aisle because they were not as intimidated to join us. And so maybe the fault is on my side. I don't want to over-explain it, but when you're restricted so tightly in what you can do and how you can act and with whom you can be seen, it does affect your ability to create a governance structure that lifts the state and moves us forward. It's clunky. It's at times goes counter in a contrary direction. Maybe I should stop.
I think this has been very constructive dialogue. I do want to bring it back to the issues that the commission is constitutionally mandated to address. As much as we all are very focused on good governance, that's something that goes a little bit beyond our purview.
That's fair.
We must follow the constitutional criteria as we are redistricting. So along those lines, I know that I'm struggling a little bit with the criteria in this particular space. I'm looking at geographical boundaries, big mountain ranges, rivers, etc. I'm looking at county lines, both of which are very old, meaning we don't control where the geographical boundaries are. The counties were established before the migration patterns of Arizona and our populations have centered. What is your opinion of balancing geographic boundaries, county lines versus communities of interest? Because these are going to be very issues that we're going to have to debate back and forth, and there will be compromises on them.
I think that's an excellent observation. I've had occasion to see some very old maps. There's a map in Globe that I like to refer to occasionally. It's hanging in a building. And the only road on the map goes between Phoenix and Globe. I'm sorry, it's a railroad. It loops around down south and comes up. And then there's railroad lines going over. but no big roads across the state like we see today. So as populations grew, which I think speaks to communities of interest, they didn't grow because they were in Pima County. They could have, because it was a huge county, as was Coconino. I think there was like 4 original big ones, but they grew because of water availability, natural resource usage. So the focus of the community was very structured. There's things that they had to do to survive and protect themselves and make sure they had water, etc. Now, as you rightly view and note, now with advancing technologies, we're growing beyond county boundaries quickly. Some of the supervisors may have to, like in Pinal County and Maricopa County, for purposes of creating transportation corridors, when their tax base is still greatly reduced. And Maricopa County has this mammoth tax base, and yet all the Maricopa people want to drive out of town on a weekend and go through the other counties. Those are instances, Madam Chairwoman, that illuminate that communities of interest gets bigger in importance as a natural consequence of time. And competitiveness is important, but it isn't the fulcrum. The fulcrum is where the people live and how do they relate to each other. And what are their views commonly about the Gila Valley? It could be a tribal area. It could be an agricultural zone where we used to have the largest agricultural output in the world in some of our areas of our state. And I think you're right in your dissection of these criteria. Maybe county lines isn't the big thing anymore, unless you had such a great disparity that you didn't see in the next decade would change much in a tax base or in a transportation capability, or that they would need to leverage for schools and educational opportunities. That's when boundaries really start to matter. Fire districts and access to medical care that way. Sometimes districts really matter when it gets down to the nuts and bolts of how to fund things.
So if I hear you correctly, I'm hearing that some of the county lines, some of the geographic boundaries, they're to be respected, but not at the expense of keeping the fundamental communities of interest together?
I think that's fair.
Okay.
I think that's fair. Respect them where you can. If I lived in Gila County, which has 3% private property, versus Maricopa County, which has the reverse. I mean, it's a big county, so it's not like 97%. But you could see how, in that case, you may want to be careful not to force one particular group who need tax relief and help and more funds generated from one that already had it. But where you can, you take those into advice, and you've got a brain trust on this committee and staff assistants that can do that and be very helpful.
Colleagues, other questions?
Hey, I've been in meetings like this.
Yeah, I'm going to presume that you did an excellent job of addressing everyone's questions. And no, it's been an informative afternoon, and if there aren't any other questions, and Speaker Bowers, if there's anything you want to sum up before we, move forward, please do so.
Just to use the written comments that President Fan, Karen, it's not Karen, it's President Fan, I'm sorry, that she and I have developed for you that might be helpful as well. So thank you. Again, it's not a thankless job because many of us are very thankful. It's a hard job. And to be able to balance all that you do requires a lot of wisdom and a lot of input. And you've certainly gone out of your way to make sure that you've had plenty of that. And I'm appreciative of you taking the assignment. And I wish you every good thing. So thank you for giving me the time to be with you.
Thank you.
Thank you very much for being here.
Yeah,
Thank you.
thank you, Speaker Bowers. We deeply appreciate the thoughtful contributions from you. We look forward to the remarks from Senator Fan and the minority leaders as well. And I can promise you we will take all of this feedback to heart and give it the deepest consideration. And as I said to your counterparts earlier, if as we're moving forward, if there's feedback or any dialogue that you'd like to continue along the deliberation process, please feel free to chime in. I'd like to remind everybody that not everything we do is we're ascribing meaning to, meaning sometimes we make mistakes or we can keep our eyes on many issues, but if we're forgetting something or, there's a red flag, we do hope everyone in the community chimes in, alerts us so that we can do the best job that we can.
Thank you.
Okay, thank you, Speaker Bowers. If there's no other questions, we will move forward to agenda item number 5, which is the next meeting date. I'd like to remind everybody that we have a public hearing tonight, 6 p.m. in Mesa. And then tomorrow we have a virtual hearing from noon to 2, depending on the number of people who are dialing in to speak. And then Tuesday, we look forward to being in Tucson. And I believe we'll also be in Maryvale on Saturday. And then on Monday morning, I look forward to convening with a formal quorum with my colleagues to begin the deliberative process. And so with that, we'll move to agenda item number 6, closing of public comments. We'll now close public comments. Please note, members of the commission may not discuss items that are not specifically identified on the agenda. Therefore, pursuant to ARS 38-431.01H, action taken as a result of public comment will be limited to directing staff to study the matter, responding to any criticism, or scheduling the matter for further consideration and decision at a later date. With that, we'll move to agenda item number 7, adjournment. I will entertain a motion to adjourn.
Vice Chair Watchman, motions to adjourn, Madam Chair.
And Commissioner Meal seconds.
With no further discussion, Vice Chair Watchman,
Aye.
Commissioner Meal,
Aye.
Commissioner Lerner,
Aye.
Commissioner York,
Aye.
Commissioner Newberg is an aye. And with that, thank you everybody for this very substantive, I think, constructive dialogue. I look forward to seeing everybody tonight in Mesa, tomorrow virtually, Saturday, Tucson, Maryville, and Monday with our deliberations. Have a great day. Bye-bye.